Hey everyone, so for tonight's data set, let's take a look at something a little bit more complex as far as data goes. And I've got our creative performance data set that was in the Dropbox link loaded into Tableau right now. And let's just go ahead and walk through how we can build a simple dashboard off of this data set. Some context around this data set. This is actual ad exchange data that you see on an ad exchange. So whenever an ad renders on a web page, this is the real-time event log data that gets stored on the back end. This has all been obfuscated, so it's not from a particular client or business or anything of that nature, but it gives you an idea of what real-world data looks like. So starting off, let's just take a look at what data we have to work with and see how it fits within our framework of starting at the highest level of aggregation and working our way down to the most granular cuts of data. So what we have here, starting in the first column, we have number of records. Oh, and by the way, I have already added the Excel file to Tableau. All you have to do is just connect to a Tableau file on the previous screen, and you'll end up on this screen. So this is basically where Tableau is getting ready to ingest this data. If your computer has issues working, if you have an older machine and you have some latency issues or slowdown with your computer, let me know and I can give you a truncated version of this data set that should be a lot easier if you have an older machine. But let's take a look at what we're working with here today. So it looks like we've got 3, 6, 9 different fields that we're working with. Pretty straightforward. Typically on an ad exchange, you're going to have lots more columns here than what we're seeing here, but I've just tried to consolidate this to what you're going to see most commonly. So number of records, this is just some metadata showing that this is an index, showing that there is one event. Let's talk about what an event is first. So you're going to have, in this data set, I believe there is going to be an impression and a click and maybe a conversion. We'll dive into that and see what types of events, but that's what it's referring to when we talk about event level data. It's basically when anything happens, whether that be an ad surfaces, a click is registered, or a conversion is logged. That's what we mean by events. And each one of these rows represents some type of event within the ad exchange. So this number of records field it's not super useful for us. It's useful from a machine's perspective to let us know that each row represents one event. Client ID, I think in this data set, we're working with just 2 different clients, so it's obfuscated, so client 1 and client 2. You can pretend it's one of your favorite brands to make it more interesting, and I can show you how to alias client 1 and client 2 and make it a made-up company or one of your favorite brands. Creative ID. Creative ID is a unique identifier that maps back to a specific creative. So within an ad campaign, you're going to have multiple types of creative that are surfacing on a display. So creative 1 may be a more traditional hero card that's high up above the fold and dominates most of the available screen real estate. And then you might have alternative creative IDs that take up a much smaller fixed 300 by 250 pixel creative size. So just think of creative ID as individual ads. So what you think of as a creative unit, each individual creative ID maps back to a creative ad. Creative size. So this is data about the creative IDs. So creative ID 510347000. Creative ID, what is the size? And this is denoted in pixels. So we've got a bunch of different common pixel dimensions for display ads. This is going to be looking at 160 by 600 pixel dimension ad. Next, we have our date. So this is a timestamp. This is automatically generated by the ad exchange we touched on this last week, but this basically stamps an event that marks it for when it happened. So each row should have a unique timestamp that we can then look at what the server log dictates happened at that time. DMA stands for Designated Market Area, I believe. It's an old nomenclature from Nielsen in the terrestrial radio and terrestrial broadcasting days. So in terrestrial radio and terrestrial broadcasting for local TV stations, it's difficult to use a zip code for a broadcast region, because a broadcast station, like a radio station, for instance, could reach multiple zip codes. So what a DMA does is it creates a designated market area to designate a family of zip codes to create its own market. That's what DMA is. It's still used today. Typically, a marketer will have a kind of like a glossary that maps back DMAs to specific trade areas. But for this case, we're going to keep it with the raw DMA codes. Event labels, we touched on this already. I believe in this data set, we're looking at clicks, impressions, and maybe conversions. We'll dig in and figure that one out. Millicent cost. So think of this as how many thousandths of a cent each one of these cost. So one way you can look at this is 1,130 cents translates into 1.13 cents. Basically, you just have to divide this by 1,000th and you'll get the actual currency that this translates to, and as far as cost goes. Now, why do we do this? From a database perspective, it's much easier to just have the raw digit there versus having to do any currency conversions, having to do any type of fancy stuff on the data types. So creating a float within your database, it just depends. More often than not, though, you're going to see this stored in a raw format for a millicent or lower. Postal code, this is giving us the actual postal code, which will be relevant for a DMA. So each DMA should be comprised of multiple postal codes. So now that we've talked through what some of these fields mean, let's start looking at how Tableau is reading our data. So going back over here, number of records, this is our index. It's reading it as a integer. That's okay. That's what this hashtag means. It's reading it as a number. Client ID, it is also reading this as a number. Remember what we talked about, how IDs are things that we want to be treated as strings, because we're not going to do any type of function or any type of mathematical operator up against this field. So whenever we have an ID, we want to make sure Tableau reads this as a string. And Tableau reads that as a string by letting us know ABC right there. So these two, we're going to convert these over to dimensions or strings once we ingest this data. Creative size, this is good. We're not going to be doing any type of multiplication or any type of operations against the creative size. We want Tableau to be reading this as a string. Date, we want Tableau is reading date here as a string. We want it to be reading it as a date timestamp. So that's another thing we're going to have to change in the underlying data. DMA, so DMAs are being read as integers. DMAs are classifiers. So we want this to be read as a string. So we got quite a bit of data to fix here. Event label is being read as a string. Impressions, clicks, that's fine for this purposes. We will be doing a count consistently on all of this. This is going to be our primary metric that we're going to be working with. Millicent cost, this is fine. It is an integer, so it's okay that Tableau is reading it as a number. And postal code, Tableau is correctly reading this as a geocode. One thing you'll notice is we have a few null values here. What that means is Tableau is having trouble either in the data, underlying data. Actually, yeah, that's what this means here. When it says null, that means it's just missing data. So this data set has a few missing postal codes. We can, to the extent we can see once we port this data in and see if that causes a problem. Sometimes having null values is okay within a certain degree. Other times it's unacceptable and we have to do some more investigation. So let's go ahead and port this data in. I'm going to click on sheet 1 to get the data into Tableau, and we're good to go. All right, let's go ahead and convert our data types. So starting up here at the top, where our dimensions are, client ID and creative ID are being read as integers or numbers. Let's change these to dimensions. We do that by right-clicking on the client ID pill, and then we're going to go to change data type to a string. Okay, easy enough. Let's do the same thing for creative ID. Right-click on creative ID pillbox, and then we're going to go to change data type, change it to a string, and we're good to go. Creative size, that is being properly read. Date, we need to change this. So right-click, change data type. Let's change this to a date. We'll just go ahead and round. Event label is a string. That's good. Postal code is being read as a geo. That is good. DMA, we want this to be read as a string. So we're going to change that data type to a string. And then we're also, so you see how we changed it here, DMA is now count of DMA. That's because even though we changed the data type to a string, we need to have Tableau treat it like a dimension. And dimensions are up here on this shelf where it says tables. So to do that, we're just going to right click on DMA and convert it to a dimension. And now you'll see DMA has moved up to the rest of our dimensions that we covered from last class. And it's being treated as a string. That's good. Okay, that's good. All right, we're good to go. So starting, let's use our framework from last class. Highest level of aggregation. This is a more complex data set. So let's just more or less do the same thing that we did last class with the fashion retail sales data. So to do that, we're just basically going to clone what we did. We took our geo data and built a map. Let's start there. So double click on postal code, and we should get a nice graphic showing a bubble for every postal code an ad impression was served. So typically what we're seeing here is this tells me a couple things. This advertising campaign has targeted all 50 states, more or less, within the United States. What it leads me to believe is it wasn't hyperly geo-targeted to any specific region within the United States, and I'm willing to bet Alaska and Hawaii were served by Hawaii and Alaska were served on accident or not really targeted. So the way we can confirm that is if we look over these Alaskan postal codes. Actually, we'll confirm that in a second. Actually. So what we're going to do is now let's add some size to these postal codes. We're going to do that by doing a count of event labels. Let's do that. Count of event labels. So when we double click on event label, because it's a string, Tableau is now segmenting our geos by 3 different types of events. We have clicks, conversions, and impressions. If you think about this as a funnel, impressions are at the top of the funnel, and conversions are at the bottom of the funnel. Think of an ad that surfaces on a website. In order for you to be converted, you have to first be exposed an ad. That's what happens at the impression level. In order to click through to an ad, you have to click. And then at the last stage of the funnel, you have the conversion. So this makes sense, actually, this representation. So the highest volume of postal codes are here at the impression level. The next highest is at the clicks. So this bottom section here shows us a map of all the postal codes that were surfaced impressions. And then this is showing us how many postal codes were surfaced clicks. And then now conversions are even fewer. Because why? We talked about this in lecture, but on average, a display campaign has less than 0.5% click-through rate. That's surprising to a lot of people. And then even once you get that click, it's an even smaller percent that actually convert. So we're visualizing the funnel here, but let's hone in on the top of funnel. Let's focus on the impression level. So to focus on that, we're going to get rid of conversions and clicks. And to do that, I'm just going to first do a count. So we go up here to the event label pill, right click, go down to measure, and then let's do count to get us a count. Next, so we are showing longitude and latitude, but what we want to see is we want to isolate just the impressions, because right now we're showing a count of impressions, clicks, and conversions. To filter that out, we are going to take the event label and drop it on the filter shelf. Go ahead and do it. And we want to select only impressions, because that's the only thing we care about for this visualization. And when we hit apply, it removes clicks and conversions. Now, let's go to our little map and click the granular map here. So this one to the right is for more like country level, regional level, and even continent level. This gives us a breakdown at the state and the zip code level. So this is how we can get into confirming that our advertiser wasn't actually trying to target Alaska and was just kind of doing a top of funnel campaign where they were just trying to reach as many relevant eyeballs as possible. To do that, we can actually just look to Alaska. So postal code 99725 had 1 impression served, 8 impressions served. Let's just go through some of these postal codes and just see it's all single or low double digits of impressions served. So Alaska doesn't really matter in this campaign. Let's confirm with Hawaii, 941. Same deal with Hawaii. Now, to compare that, let's hover over here into some of these zip codes. We're actually seeing fairly low impression level, but the bulk of our campaign's impressions were served here in the mainland US. So let's go ahead and just clean this up from an advertiser's perspective and from a usability standpoint. We've got a lot of open space. So to do that, we are going to hover over this play button on our map. If you select this magnifying glass with a rectangle, this is your zoom lasso, or zoom area is what it's called now. If you click this and select in the Pacific Northwest region and hold down your mouse, select here and hold down with your mouse and highlight just the mainland US and let go, Tableau now zooms in on this area. Now we do have to remember to remove that feature, otherwise we won't be able to click anywhere without zooming in. So to do that, we just go ahead and select our crosshair, and now we can select and hover easily. So let's go ahead and make this map a little bit more visually appealing here. First thing we can do is let's increase our size. Increase the size of the postal codes. Okay. That's actually, what am I doing? Okay. So count of event label, let's drop that on size. Okay. Oh, that's actually, yeah, that's right, because it's pretty well distributed. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Now let's try our, map layers. So if you go up here to our map options and formatting, we're going to select map. Let's see if I can get this right. I always get this wrong. I think it's map layers. Yeah, we got it right. So for map layers, let's select our background where it's style. Let's change this to a dark. Okay, great. So now we've got a little bit more contrast here. Let's go ahead and let's take the washout. Not that far. Washout just basically helps us build a little bit more contrast. I'm just going to play around with this to see what it looks like. 10%. Okay, that looks a little bit more usable to me. I'm just ballparking it at 10%. Let's just go ahead and use that. Real quick, I'm going to try something here where I'm going to drop event label. I'm trying to get our sizing a little different. There we go. So when I dropped event label onto size, now I was able to size our geos. So let's see what happens when. So we can make our bubbles a little bit bigger. I'm going to keep it about, just ballpark it, around half, give or take, over under, will be fine, because we are going to make, after sizing it, we are going to make it change the opacity to be a little bit more see-through. So I'm going to change the opacity now to 70%. Okay, now we can see a little bit more translucent. See, so this is pretty cool. We've built out this geographic distribution of where our impressions have been served on our ad campaign. What can we see from this? Well, just I'm no geography expert, but just from seeing this is clustered mostly around metropolitan regions. You can see Central Texas, North Texas where Dallas is at, Eastern Texas with Houston, California, you can see the Bay Area, LA, and the surrounding metropolitan region, and then and also in New England, you can see all the major metropolitan regions up there. So this is going to be our first visualization. Double click down on sheet 1, and let's call this geographic distribution of impressions. Oop, I misspelled that. Distribution of impressions. And if you're having trouble with any of this, feel free to hit pause and switch over to the Zoom. Happy to answer any questions you have. All right, so we've got our map built. Let's go ahead and hit new worksheet. Let's build a time series now to see how, let's take a look at how our events were trending over time. This will help us visualize our funnel a little bit better. So if we take date, which is being read as a calendar, double check that, double click on date, and now Tableau is defaulting to the highest level of aggregation, which is the year. So let's disaggregate this. Right click on the year of date pillbox. Let's come down. Remember, this first section is discrete. We want continuous. So let's just take a look at what the lowest level of aggregation is. I think this is a 1 month campaign, so daily level data should be fine. It's actually 3 days. Awesome. 5 day of date. Let me just double check that. 1 month. Yeah, it's just 1 month. So this is this campaign is 3 days of data that we're working with. And then let's go ahead and bring in the event label, which is going to be account. Okay. And then we're going to change event label to account, because right now we're just segmenting to account. So now we've got a three points on a line chart for 3 days of data. So this is actually the truncated data set. I was wondering why this data set was going so much faster. If you're working with the full size data set, you should have an entire month of data, but for expediency purposes, we're just going to be working with 3 days of data here. I think this is a pretty large data set. So more or less it's the same, just a larger data set with more days if you're working with the full size. So we have 3 days of data. Let's go ahead and segment this by the event type. So if we could do that by taking event label and dropping it on the color. And so we've got clicks, conversions, and impressions. Impressions, as we saw earlier, is going to be the top of funnel. We have way more impressions than we have clicks and conversions. Let's see what happens when we take impressions out. So if we take event label and drop it to the filter shelf, let's just take a look. We're going to remove impressions so that clicks and conversions are the only things showing. Hit apply. Okay, so now we can see how clicks are the second largest in volume. And then we have conversions being the smallest. So we had 13 conversions on November 6th, 5 on November 5th, versus 16 clicks on November 5th, and 60 clicks on November 6th. So this is one way we can look at the data. If when you have more days of data with the larger data set, this becomes a lot more interesting, but for the sake of your machines not crashing, we're going to work with just 3 days of data for here. So let's just call this time series. Or actually, let's call this trended clicks and conversions. Okay. Next, let's take a look at the performance of particular creative types. So let's go ahead and go to Creative ID. We're going to bring this in to build a creative scorecard. So right here, we have all of the unique creative IDs that are within this ad campaign. Next, let's bring in the creative size. Okay. Let me do a quick check real quick. There we go. Cool. So instead of bringing creative ID in first, how we had it here, once you have this, let's rearrange creative ID to move to the right of the creative size. I'll explain why we're doing that. Because each creative size can have multiple creative IDs associated with it. Each one of these creative IDs is an individual ad. So the 728 by 90 pixel creative size has 5 different ads associated with it, whereas our other 2 creatives only have 2 associated creatives with it. Awesome. So now let's go ahead and bring in our event label. So when you double click event label, we get clicks, conversions, and impressions. Let's go ahead and hover over here to get our horizontal resizing bar. Drag this out a little bit. You don't have to go as hard as I did, just to give a breakdown. So what we want to look at now is we want to reorganize impressions. We do that by clicking and dragging our column headers. So I just dragged impression over to the left. It might look different from you depending on if you hit any sorting, but basically if you just click and hold one of these column labels and just reorganize it, you should be able to reorganize how it goes. So this way we're building a funnel. Impression is top of funnel, click is intermediate funnel, and conversion is at the bottom of the funnel. Now let's go ahead and bring in event label again, but this time we're going to do a count on it. So when we bring in that, we're going to go up to event ID or event label, and let's do a count. Okay, great. So Tableau defaults to trying to visualize this. I just want it in tabular format so that we can just see what raw numbers are. And then let's go ahead and sort descending. All right, cool. What's the first thing that pops out to you? First thing that pops out to me is I need to resize this again. But we have our creative with the most impressions here is creative 504, and that had 23,000 impressions, which generated 28 clicks and 6 conversions. Let's take a look at what that CTR is, or click-through rate. So we don't have click-through rate in this data, but you can calculate that by doing 28 over 23,000. That's actually less than what's average. That's much less actually, but it's sometimes you have poor performing ads. So 28 over 23,000 is roughly, I think it's like a tenth of a percent is the click-through rate. And so this is actually good feedback that our highest performing, or our creative with the most impressions had a below industry standard click-through rate. That's important if you are a designer or a media buyer. That's important for you to know because it could be the copy, it could be the creative, it could be the target, it could be a whole slew of things that you're going to need to investigate further downstream. The other thing that you can see is we've got conversions. So our top converting creative in nominal terms is this creative ID. If the bottom line is we're just optimizing for conversions, then there are a couple of things we could optimize here. We could optimize the creative, we could optimize the copy, we can optimize geo-targeting to help try and gas this number up. And then we've also got these two creatives here, which have driven 5 and 5 conversions. And then here we have what looks like a hole in the data. This is probably one of our null values that we saw. It drove 0 impressions, 0 clicks, but 1 conversion. How do you have a conversion without a click? This is an example of a data quality issue. This is something you encounter all the time in the real world. So the way you rectify this, because it's one event that's a problem, it's inconsequential to us, but I wanted to include this here to show you that the real world data isn't perfect whenever you mess with it, unfortunately. And this is an example of that. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and take a look at this and segment this out a little further. So let's take client ID. Let's take client ID, drop that on our filter shelf. So remember, we have two clients here, client 1 and client 2. Let's select both and hit OK. Let's come back to client ID, right click, go to show filter. And now we can toggle between client 1 or client 2 or client 1 and look at how performance changes for each creative across both clients. Now again, please do not leave this wireframe format. Let's change this by selecting the drop down, going to, since it's only 2 clients, we're going to use a single value list. This will give us a radio button here for all client 1 or client 2 or all. And next we want to do the drop down again, apply all to worksheets or apply to worksheets, all using related data source. So now this filter will act as a filter on our geo map. We can confirm that. Now let's look at geographic distribution of impressions. Okay, so this gives us how many impressions we've served in North America. Now let's change to just client 2, and it should look very different. Yes, so we reduced our impression rate by about 30% just by changing that filter from client 1 to client 2. Let's not forget, we need to reset our filter. So go ahead and hit all. Good. All right, cool. So next up, let's take a look at, first, let's call this Creative Scorecard. Creative scorecards are used frequently by media planners, media buyers, and even creative folks who want to evaluate the performance of their creative and sometimes you might be A/B testing. So like these 2 creatives here, even though they're the same size, you might be A/B testing 2 different types of copy with different calls to action. Which one has a higher conversion rate? So this is one use case where this is used in a live campaign setting. Next up, all right, so let's create a new worksheet. And let's take a look at our top 10 DMAs. So first of all, DMA is going to be, so you saw how many postal codes we have. DMAs are a designated market area. We're going to have a lot of DMAs here. So let's go ahead and double click on DMA. So we've got a lot of DMAs here. And then let's do let's take a look at how impression. Let's create a scorecard for DMAs. So we've got, I double clicked on event label, and we're going to do the same thing we did before. Bring in event label one more time, and we're going to change this to a measure. So we're doing a count of each one. Okay, great. So this is telling us, yeah, okay, cool. So what we can do now is we can look at which DMAs were targeted most heavily in this ad campaign. Let's go ahead and filter out clicks and conversions the same way we did before by taking event label, dropping this on filter, and let's leave only impressions selected. When we hit apply, we should just get a breakdown of impression now. So which DMAs were hit with the most impressions. Now let's sort this descending to make this a little bit more usable. So to do that, we just click here, toggle. And now this is still a pretty large and widely distributed bar graph. Let's make this a little bit more usable. So so we have well over 100 unique DMAs here. Let's say we only care, as marketers, we only care about our top 10 largest DMAs as defined by impressions. To do that, we're going to create another filter for DMA. Go to DMA, drop it on the filter shelf, and we're going to go to the top header here. Hit top. We're going to select by field. So here we're introducing some logic on Tableau side. So what we're going to tell Tableau to do is return only the top 10 DMAs, because we're filtering by DMA, and we're going to determine the top 10 by a count of event label. And because we have our impression filter already on here, it's only going to be filtering by top 10 impressions. So when we hit OK, it gets drastically reduced. Now let's add a little bit more distribution to let's add some gradient to our bar chart now. do that, we're going to do the exact same thing we did. We're going to take event label, drop it on color, and so right now it's only coloring it by impression because we have a filter on for our impression level filter. What we want to do now is change this logic to right click, measure, count. So now we're color coding by how many impressions were served to that DMA. If we want to add a label, it's the same thing. We're going to take event label, drop it on the label tile right here, and then change our function to a measure count. There we go. So let me undo what I just did, because when we dropped it without a function on it, it just called the impression label. What we want to do is a count of unique labels. So measure count. And that's how we got this. I don't particularly care to label things like this, because if you wanted to see the exact or precise value, you can just hover and you'll get this tooltip that'll show you 7,481. So I don't usually leave this on. In some cases I will, but this is one case where I don't think it's necessary. So I'm just going to take this and drag it off. Awesome. So let's call this top 10 DMAs, or top 10 targeted DMAs. Awesome. So now we're getting ready to pull things together. So let's review what we've done. We've got a geographic distribution of impressions. We've got a trend line of clicks and conversions. This isn't particularly useful because it's a subset of our data set. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this out. You can keep it if you want, but just because it's only 3 days, unless you're using the full data set, I'm just not going to include this just because it's 3 points of data. It's not super interesting. I'll show you what the full data set looks like if you're interested, but it is on there. Creative scorecard, so we can evaluate the performance of specific creative, and then we've got top 10 targeted DMAs. So let's go ahead and bring this together into a dashboard by going here to this middle icon for new dashboard. Click that. First thing we need to do every time is go to size and let's make this dynamic so that the dashboard will auto scale to the size of the device viewing the dashboard. So to do that, we're going to hit automatic. Great. And I'm going to go ahead and bring the map in first. Great. Cool. Now let's take our top 10 targeted DMAs and move that to the right of our map. To do that, you're just going to hold where we're dragging that worksheet title until you get this grayed out section up to the right. Great. Now let's change the sizing to fit. If we hit this drop down, go to fit, entire view. Okay. This will come in handy later. Now let's take our creative scorecard and bring this to the bottom hemisphere. Make sure you get the sizing right. This is what it should look like before you release. It should take up the entire bottom hemisphere. Okay. And now let's click this drop down for our creative scorecard and fit this for the entire view as well, just because we're dealing with, we have a lot of space here to play with. So great, we've got a pretty clean presentation now. So what this is used for in the industry is for media planners, creatives, copywriters, things of that, folks within those functions, and even analysts too, to make strategic recommendations on where they should allocate ad spend. This is a type of dashboard I've built multiple times for folks on the marketing side and the creative side to help evaluate the actual performance of their campaigns. So we also need to make this dynamic. So let's go ahead and hover over and click on the white space of the map right here. I'm going to enact this filter button right here to turn on dynamic filtering. This is very important. Please do not forget to do this. Click in the white space for our top 10 targeted DMAs. And let's hit the filter button as well. And then we're going to do the same for our creative scorecard. Select in the white space and turn this on. So what this enables us to do is it allows us to have a conversation with our data. So the 803 DMA was our second most highly targeted DMA. Well, what does that mean geographically? What does that mean from a creative standpoint? Now we can just click on that bar and it spits out the region. So it looks like Southern California is the 803 DMA, and these are how our creatives are performing in those regions. It looks like no conversions came from that section. Ooh, what did I do? Huh. My impressions just got really big for some reason. All right, let's take a look at why that's happening. I told you we were going to break things, and we're already breaking things. So this is fun. So let's troubleshoot this. So to take a look at what's going on, why this map is acting this way, I'm going to select here, go to sheet. Otherwise, you can just click on the geographic distribution of impressions, and I am going to take a look at my sizing. I'm going to bring this down a little bit because it looks like, oh, I see. Action, I'm going to take a look at my filters. Yeah, got it. So I see what happened. Okay. So we are looking at DMAs at the impression level. And then so the filter is passing not just the DMA, but also the impression filter over here. And Tableau's not liking that. Let's take a look at what we can do here. Even if we fix it. Impression 602 DMA. Okay. Is that filter? Did I screw something up? Let's take a look here. Okay, yeah. I see. All right, so I'm back and I figured out what I did wrong. So if you remember, we left this geo map completely unfiltered. So it was showing impressions, clicks, and conversions. Here, we tried to get fancy and isolate just the impressions and get rid of the conversions and clicks. Tableau doesn't like that when we start trying to cross-apply filters. So the way to fix this is if you go to your top 10 DMAs, well, first go to your geographic map, and let's bring down the size of these. Originally, we had them up to the midway point, but that's way too big once you start factoring in impressions, clicks, and conversions. Instead, do what we defaulted to earlier in the class to just this lower sized. You can bring it up a little bit more than that. I'm going to put it right somewhere in there. You'll be fine. It doesn't need to be perfect. And then we're going to go over to this top 10 targeted DMAs. And what I did is I right-clicked on the event label filter and then enabled the show filter button. And I got rid of this wireframe to become a single value list so that we could toggle between clicks, top 10 DMAs by clicks, by conversions, and impressions. Tableau likes that much more, even though it's not as pretty to look at because impressions make up the bulk of this campaign. It's skewing things, and conversions and clicks don't really show up unless you hone in on them. Remember, we only had a handful of clicks and even smaller volume of conversions that we saw on our creative scorecard. So let's just go ahead and reorganize this one more time and bring impressions over here. And I'm going to bring clicks over by dragging the column. So now we have our funnel baked in. Impressions are the highest volume, followed by clicks, conversions, and we can see that mirrored when we toggle our filter here. Cool. And I'm going to enable this. Oh, it's already enabled. So yeah. And now when we go back to our dashboard, we've got a client filter. So client 2. Let's look at client 2's impressions, clicks, and conversions, and their corresponding DMA. So this client 2 only had one conversion that came from the 505 DMA, which looks like it is, it's too small for me to see. It's somewhere on this map. Client 1, on the other hand, we can validate this, had significantly much more. Client 1 had significantly much more impression as well as click and conversion activity. And we can see the distribution of their conversions and impressions here. Cool. Now we can see the scorecard. So this is a really useful tool to evaluate creative performance and targeting at a geo level as well. All right, next we are going to go ahead and save this. So make sure you have all of your filters unselected. Have everything defaulted to all. I'm actually going to get rid of some of this legend to clean up some real estate. Same with event label. So that way we just have our filters. You can also alternatively move your filters up here to the upper quadrant up here and drag it down if you want. And then you can bring your event labels adjacent to it and resize this. Just resize it. Some people like it like this. I'm not a big fan of it, but do what you like best. I'm going to go ahead and undo. But I just want to show you that that is one capability that you can unlock. So to publish this to Tableau server, we are going to go to File, Save to Tableau Public as the public server. You're going to be prompted to log in. And I think that's my password. And once, okay, we're going to title this workbook MKT 178 Intro to AdTech, and we are done. All right, feel free to hop on the Zoom if you have any questions, but we are done.